Hello and welcome to Talking TED with Jen, where I review several of the most popular TED Talks of all time. And I'm super excited to bring to you today Daniel Pink's The Puzzle of Motivation. Before I get started into specific techniques that I think we should examine more closely, I do want to share with you that this series will be ending next week. And so if you want to get in on how I can do these types of evaluations for your presentation, make sure you see the video description below this video, because I will have my Black Friday special on how to improve your presentation skills listed there, where I'll be giving you $100 off my speaker strategy session. This is a sale I've not offered before, and it does expire by November 27th. So see the link below in the video to get all details and schedule your free call with me to discuss if it's a fit for you. I also do an evaluation using a speaker feedback form. This is what I'm using for all my private coaching clients, as well as the TED Talk review series. If you don't have a copy of this form, you just have to hop on my email list and I will provide it in my summary on Fridays. So let's talk about the specifics of Daniel Pink's TED Talk. So this particular talk was delivered at TEDGlobal in 2009 in England. And Daniel Pink is a very famous author. I've actually read a lot of his books, and I'm a huge fan of his books, in particular the book When. If you haven't read it, I highly recommend it. I did hear him present locally too for a sales networking group that I belong to here in Minnesota. So it was kind of fun that I had a chance to interact with him prior to watching his most popular TED Talk. This TED Talk was delivered or watched at least almost 29 million times. So he definitely received a lot of traction from this talk. And his word count is 2,836. If you're not familiar, look at my previous videos in this TED Talk series about why word count matters, because it does matter in terms of when you're scripting your talk and how to know how long it's going to take you to deliver that talk. You should have an idea of what your word count is. So there are lots of good things I'd like to share with you in terms of what Daniel Pink did very well. But first, I'd like to go over one of the specific categories on my speaker feedback form here. And let's talk about organization. One of the things I think he did a fabulous job of in his TED Talk is he repeated himself at key moments during his presentation. And I will play 3 of them for you. Let's get started with those 3 specific sections where he repeated himself. Repeating yourself is a very good technique as a speaker, and we'll debrief in just a moment.
When I got to law school, I didn't do very well. To put it mildly, I didn't do very well. In fact.
So that was second 33 within his presentation, where he repeated himself. I didn't do very well in law school. If you're not familiar with Daniel Pink or his persona, he frequently talks about the fact that he went to law school and that perhaps he was an outlier and did not do so well within law school. So that's his opening kind of introduction to himself. And there's another section where he also repeats himself. We're going to navigate to that and play it here. Listen in.
You were timing for norms. You were incentivizing. What happened this time? This time, the incentivized group kicked the other group's butt. Why? Because when the tacks are out of the box.
Okay, well, I didn't navigate to the right one. So we're going to go to the last instance where he repeats himself, which is towards the end of his presentation. And you know, if you've been following these TED Talk reviews, I do acts when I'm looking at the organization of the presentation. So the first act was in that first snippet I gave you. That 5-minute would have been his second act. And now in his third act, he has another instance of repeating himself. We're going to navigate to that one, and I'll try to identify which specific moment in the notes here he did in the second act repeat himself. All right, let's listen in to the third time he repeats himself in his presentation.
Own sake, the drive to do things because they matter. And here's the best part. Here's the best part. We already know this.
Okay, did you catch that? He went through it pretty quickly, but he said, here's the best part. Here's the best part. What does repeating do from a speaker standpoint? Well, one of the things I noted was what he repeated. It was almost like a crutch sentence for him. he didn't repeat his key concept or key idea that he wants the audience to remember, which is typically what speakers do, is they'll repeat something they want their audience to memorize or to recall after the presentation is over. Unfortunately, he repeated his own statement again, which could lead weight to it and let the audience know this is a powerful thing that you need to pay attention to. Now let's talk at one other organization point that I noted throughout his presentation. He frequently switched his pronouns. And what I mean by this is when he was in his first act, the first third of his talk, he said, I went to law school. I didn't do very well. Then he talked about the candle experiment where the researchers, he and they, were working on a particular experiment, which was a very interesting experiment, by the way. I highly encourage you to listen to the whole talk. But then he went into they again, because there was a different experiment with economists from the London School of Economics. And then he went back to we. Here's what we need to gather from this. So he frequently switched his pronouns. And if you watched my TED Talk with Julian Treasure last week, where he frequently used the word we, it was one of the most frequently used words in his entire talk. He created a connection through using we. But Daniel Pink was less successful at this because he wasn't consistent with who he was addressing. The audience will be unclear who you're addressing if you don't use you or we, and you frequently go to third person or first person. It's a little unclear who you're actually addressing. And so the audience may feel like you're not addressing them specifically, and they may not feel like they have any buy-in into your particular talk and whether that idea is something they would like to share afterwards. So from an organizational standpoint, I would say that would be something he could work on better for next time. Now, I want to give some kudos because one of the sections on my feedback form as well is kudos. I want my clients to feel good about their speaking technique, and many speakers do things more right than they do them wrong. So I always give kudos to my speakers. But one of the things that was really clear to me and clear throughout the entire presentation is Daniel Pink has very presidential type movements. He talks a lot with his hands, but he does very specific, powerful gestures that you might see from presidents. And if you look at his biography linked below this video, he actually was a speechwriter for Al Gore. So you know that he lives in Washington, D.C. So you know that he comes by this honestly, and he tends to fall into those powerful gestures. Now, I'll name the gestures. This is my own naming convention. It's not coming from anywhere, but he did this a lot, which I will call setting the table. He did the Cheerio grab a lot, where he was highlighting a point by the Cheerio grab. This is what little children will do when they're grabbing a Cheerio, right? He also did a lot of lunging from side to side. Now, that could be a distracting factor, and I don't know how nervous he was. It could be just his crutch or his nerves. It could be he likes to talk with his hands and his body, which some people do. But in order to distract or to reduce distractions, he could focus on, staging himself a little bit differently. He also did things like prayer position in the beginning. He had his hands together in his introduction, and he used very powerful, again, presidential gestures. He would often reach to the side about this experiment, use his body to share. At this point in this experiment, he did the small, medium, and large, which is really helpful for visual folks. So he didn't need to rely upon slides or visuals behind him on the screen, and he had very few of them because he himself is a visual performer. So that came through very strongly. And for me, I'm not as much into presidential types of gestures. I understand the power play and the dynamics involved there. I don't necessarily use those types of gestures myself personally. So it's not really my style, but it's his style. And he leaned into it very heavily, which was very authentic for him. I also want to highlight another kudos of a phrase that I think was brilliant. And I just have to share this because this is something I will remember and take away from this presentation. And I'd be curious if this is something that you also would take away from this presentation, because it just hit me that strongly. And I'm curious if I'm the only one who feels this way, because I love words, I love wordplay, and I think he just did a fabulous job of this. Let's listen into this brilliant phrase he delivered.
Self-direction works better. Let me give you some examples of some kind of radical notions of self-direction. And what this means, you don't see a lot of it, but you see the first stirrings of something really interesting going on. Because what it means is, paying people adequately and fairly, absolutely. Getting the issue of money off the table and then giving people lots of autonomy. Let me give you some examples. How many of you have heard of the company Atlassian? Okay, looks like less than half.
This is where I need to get better on my notes because apparently I did not. Here we go. Let's try this.
Traditional notions of management are great if you want compliance. But if you want engagement, self-direction works better. Management is it's not a tree, it's a television set, okay?
There we have it, minute 12 and 49 seconds. Management is not a tree, it's a television set. That just struck me as a very powerful phrase. And one of the ways I was thinking, because I think in titles, I think in phrasing, that's just how I operate as a speaker. And I'm not saying he has to operate the same way I do, but it made me curious. Why didn't he say management is not a tree, it's a TV? Because the repetition of those similar sounds do have a stronger flavor than television set. So while I love this phrase and I will continue to use this phrase, and I think it's a phrase that speaks very strongly to what message he's relaying, I'm wondering why he didn't just say TV. Okay, so we talked about what he did really well. He had presidential gestures that were very powerful. He had great phrasing, and he also had probably the most beautiful conclusion I've seen in a TED Talk so far. And this time I will navigate to the right part of his conclusion, but I'm going to share the entire conclusion with you because I really think he did such a fabulous job in terms of his organization, in terms of the call to action he was leaving us with. It was 100% clear what his conclusion involved. So I want to play this here. And he had just talked about Encarta versus Wikipedia. Okay. And he has a very okay. I'm going to navigate it to it. Here we go. Let's listen into the conclusion.
Purpose in a knockout. Let me wrap up. There's a mismatch between what science knows and what business does. And here's what science knows. 1, those 20th century rewards, those motivators we think are the natural part of business, do work, but only in a surprisingly narrow band of circumstances. 2, those if-then rewards often destroy creativity. 3, the secret to high performance isn't rewards and punishments, but that unseen intrinsic drive, the drive to do things for their own sake, the drive to do things because they matter. And here's the best part. Here's the best part. We already know this. The science confirms what we know in our hearts. So if we repair this mismatch between what science knows and what business does, if we bring our motivation, notions of motivation into the 21st century, if we get past this lazy, dangerous ideology of carrots and sticks, we can strengthen our businesses, we can solve a lot of those candle problems, and maybe we can change the world. I rest my case.
So I do think that that was probably one of the most powerful conclusions I've ever heard, because he was, let me wrap up, and he had a significant pause. Now, this is a speaker who does not pause a lot during his presentation. In fact, what I suggested in next steps for this talk to make it even better next time was to include more audience engagement, because the audience would laugh, would applaud, but he did not tend to acknowledge their response or their engagement. He just charged right ahead. He delivered this TED Talk again. So one of the most important things about working with a public speaking coach is, one, I give you specific feedback according to your goals as a speaker. Now, I don't know what his goals are, but everyone has room for improvement. And this talk was delivered over 10 years ago. So I'm sure he has already identified some of these things that he would like to improve on for himself personally. If he was working with me, here are the next steps I would recommend for his situation. He did not engage the audience to the same extent some of the other speakers we've heard from have done. Other than one moment at minute 2.5 or so, he acknowledged an audience member who was making a motion in terms of how they would solve the candle experiment. And he acknowledged that audience member, which is really hard as a speaker to pick a single individual out of an audience. But I think he did that particularly well. However, the rest of the time, he did not allow the audience to catch up with him. They would laugh. They would even applaud, and he would not necessarily loop that into his talk or even pause and let it marinate a little bit. So he was a little bit rushed, I feel like, and he could have given the audience more opportunity to engage with him. Now, he did use a lot of rhetorical questions where he ended his sentence with right. And I do think there was one very powerful moment. I call them human moments. We've seen it with every speaker I've gone through so far, but one of his most powerful human moments is one I'm going to navigate to now, because I think it was a good example of how he engaged the audience and let them catch up to him. Let's listen in.
Even philosophy. This is a fact. Or as we say in my hometown of Washington, D.C., a true fact. Let me give you.
Now, we saw that he stated the sentence. The audience started laughing and clapping, and he was going to continue speaking. He said, "Let me," and then he paused. This is the mark of a great speaker, because you recognize the audience is trying to catch up with you and you're allowing them to catch up with you. But I would say throughout the rest of the presentation, he did not allow the audience to catch up with him, and he kind of charged ahead with whatever he wanted to say. And there was one other thing that I think is worth pointing out. Now, he kind of plays around with this sarcasm around being a lawyer and how it's the biggest regret of his life, which is ironic because he just wrote a book on regret. But it's interesting that when he stepped onto the stage, what is he wearing? He's wearing a suit coat. He's wearing a button-up shirt. He's wearing something that you might consider a lawyer would wear in a courtroom. But that was part of his persona, because he identified himself as a lawyer, tongue-in-cheek rather, and he dressed up as the part, and he was making a case throughout the course of his presentation. So he embraced that persona, and I know he tends to use this in other environments as well. It's not just on a TED Talk stage. What was curious for me is, was that the right way to introduce himself as part of his TED Talk to create that connection with the audience? He frequently said, "I'm an American." He was speaking in England. Was that a connection opportunity, or was that just him sitting within who he is as a person? Some people may say that made him more authentic. For me, authenticity is a fine line, but you also have to be aware of what your audience is looking for from a speaker. So there was an opportunity for him to come up in a very casual outfit, or perhaps less lawyer-like, if he so chose, because when he introduced himself as a regretful lawyer, that may not have been a connection point with some of the audience members who perhaps are lawyers, or perhaps worked really hard to be lawyers and are very proud of that fact. So it was an interesting introduction to himself, and the only time he got really personal. Otherwise, most of his content was heavily on studies and research and making the case. So I would question what type of response he might receive if he stepped onto that stage differently than as a lawyer. This is my review of Daniel Pink's The Puzzle of Motivation, which is a TED Talk that has been reviewed over 29 million times. Obviously, he knows how to connect with his audience and share a message. So if you have been enjoying this TED Talk series, I need your help. Can you please share with me which of the 5 videos I linked below in this video I should deliver my next TED Talk review on? Now, there are 5 different videos I chose because they're videos that sound interesting to me. So vote for your choice. You can comment below the video. You can email me, and I'll have further instructions in my video description as well. And don't forget to check out my Black Friday special. If you've been enjoying this video series and you have a presentation you would like my eyes and ears on, I'm happy to support you, but only through November 27th, because I want to make sure that I can serve the clients that show up and are ready to take their presentations to the next level. In the meanwhile, join me next week for Viewer's Choice, whichever TED Talk you vote for that I will be reviewing next. And my name is Jen. Thank you for joining me. We'll see you next week.